All right. It's our second discussion in cohort 4 of chapter 1. Does anyone at the beginning want to just bring up any comment or any specific question about chapter 1? Or otherwise we can look at one recent stream transcript. Okay. So, Terry, you asked a question about the generative model and the generative process. So maybe just summarize that question, and then we'll see how it played out recently.
My question was, when we're trying to create a model, we create the generative model. We sort of define it in over four sort of domains, and then you define the generative process. But now, if we think of the Markov blanket as separating the internal state from the unknowable external state, well, if we're creating a model and that model depends on us creating something that is in fact unknowable, or is there not a corruption within that thought process? So it creates an impression that within the context of, if I take my Markov blanket as being my skin, then I cannot know what is the generative process. So there's got to be some flaw in our system of modeling if it depends on creating something we can't know.
All right, awesome. And when you asked that, it made me think of the recent stream with Maxwell Ramstead, Mal Aparasan, and Ali and others. And this highlighted a inconsistency in the generative model, generative process topic. Ali, do you want to summarize what you asked and what they wrote or said?
Yeah, of course. We were talking about the discrepancy between Maxwell's presentation and also the recent paper, because in figure 1 in inner screen paper, they have indicated generative model as encompassing the whole shebang. Encompassing the internal states, the external states, and of course the blanket states. So nowhere generative process was visible in this diagram. So we were discussing with Daniel, Sanjeev, and others where exactly generative process can be manifested in this diagram. So I basically asked this question: where is the generative process in this diagram? And surprisingly, Maxwell somehow disowned the earlier literature on generative process, and basically, he just interpreted the generative model in a kind of new, more sophisticated way that wouldn't require any separate entity as generative process, because generative model basically includes the joint probability of every possible everything that Markov blanket partitions. So it is a joint probability of internal states, blanket states, and the external states. But on the other hand, when we want to model a situation and not just describe a physical phenomena or a physical system, then of course we can define our own generative model as something or let's put it this way, as a kind of dynamics that we expect the system or the situation we have to follow those dynamics. And so, for instance, if we want to model a very simple linear behavior of a, I don't know, mechanical system, then of course the Newtonian mechanics, or the terms, the Lagrangian mechanics of the system can constitute the generative process of the system. So yeah, that's basically the gist of Maxwell's argument, at least as far as I understand it.
Yeah. Quite a discussion. We can kind of parse it out better, but the transcript's out there. Like, so, as with everything in the textbook, it's kind of like there's some internal ontology, and then it's somehow aligned with the broader active gestalt. And for that, you will still, it helps to understand the generating process and the particles of the agent. And so like to the earlier question, how can you model the unknown? Because you're modeling something into existence in the act of modeling. So you can have the real temperature of the room, do statistics on an unobserved that maps to the observables. So in practice, there's no issue, but then people have a lot of degrees of interpretation with what that means, and that's the whole, and what that means for different situations. But all that aside, in terms of these two ways to talk about generative model, generative process, as it's being shown in the inner screen paper, the generative model is just the entire process giving rise to 100% of the systems level description, including states that generate other observables. Whereas in the textbook, they go to some length and distinction to highlight the generative model, which has an aboutness of a generative process. The underlying particular partition, like separating it this way, is not changed. So it's the same topology of the underlying graph that gives rise to all the formalisms. But it's just kind of it's truly a nomenclature question about where you say, okay, now these, it's like what, yeah. It's just a nomenclature question about describing this, but it's one that always comes up. So what does anyone think about this? It's kind of a funny, random, but cool ongoing topic.
Sorry, if I may add some additional comments to what I just previously said. I mean, to my mind, this recent interpretation actually makes more sense, because one of the misconceptions around FEP has always been how can we sure about how to model generative process if the causes of the observables are, as the name suggests, latent states or hidden states, right? So if we don't know the exact causes of those observations, how is it possible to model it in a precise probabilistic terms? But in this new way of looking at the generative model versus generative process, well, we can basically, somehow put this issue under the rug by somehow reinterpreting the generative model as including both the external states and the internal states, and only following the variational density of the internal states as tracing or tracking or not tracking the external state. So that's basically, I mean, the whole thing, the whole model, and its whole relation with the quote unquote reality is something more akin to probably an instrumentalist view of reality rather than, I mean, the realist perspective, because here we just use this theoretical framework only to account for the parts of the reality or the behavior of the reality that we can model. It looks like a tautology, but that's basically what I understood by this new interpretation. So that's probably one of the ways to evade those criticisms or misconceptions around the generative process.
Thank you, Ali. Very interesting. Just to kind of connect this to a previous discussion in live stream 6, one of the early paper-based discussions, this was like described as the tale of two densities, and we probably even use this meme still. But the tale of two densities was the generative direction from the temperature in the room, hidden state, emitting thermometer readings was the generative model. Generative direction. It's referring to the same graph still. And the recognition density was like from the sensor data, the incoming. And so that led to a lot of, well, like, okay, the generative is action, the recognition sensory. And I think what Ali is pointing to is that if you just kind of say, well, even if it has a million nodes, whether one's internal or external blanket is relative to whichever one you're talking about. So those are not absolute states. So you might as well just call the whole thing a generative model, still with certain components whose sparseness gives them certain properties. But there's no need to necessarily distinguish between these two. But still, it makes sense to think about an agent-based modeling perspective and about the process that generates. So it's not that it invalidates what the textbook says just from a first thought. It just sort of expands the scope of what people will probably mean with generative model, which is just to say the whole generating architecture of the program, probably also closer with generative AI. So it's probably a good direction to go. But it will still, but this could be thought of as just like agent and niche.
But can I? Yeah. This could be a problem for me about using language, right? So whenever you say there is a temperature in the hidden external state, there's no such, when you say temperature, that's a perception, or we can think of it as a representative of the amount of energy in that external state, and we perceive it as a qualia of heat. But actually we've kind of no idea what that is. We use this term temperature, but we don't know what that means. If you think of that, like the physics of information physics as information process, and so the temperature is information that exists in the unknowable external state. Our perception of temperature is actually part of the electromagnetic spectrum. The infrared light is what we detect as temperature, and then we call it a thing in the we make an assumption about what that means in the external state. But really, I kind of think that our qualia of temperature isn't what we mean when we measure the temperature of the external state with a thermometer or a temperature receptor in our skin. So again, I always feel like I'm talking like I've taken too many drugs and I'm a 14-year-old, but this kind of it feels like there are loads of like syntax errors in the thought processes around all this, and it confuses me.
Alexi?
Yeah, had a perspective on this question. Please bear with me if it sounds a little too simplistic. And, think about it this way, I'm quoting Mark Solms, by the way. If my body is immersed in an environment with, 70 degrees Celsius temperature, and I don't solve that problem, I die. If my body is immersed in the environment with 0 degrees Celsius, and I don't solve that problem, I die. So at some point, it is not about complex philosophical things, because you can go into physics. Originally, temperature and entropy were variables designed for a system at equilibrium. So we can get as semantically complex as you like. But again, taken back to bodies, there is that very specific thing that if you, are outside of the homeostatic range of temperatures and you do not solve that problem, originally through reflexes, through sweating or whatever, and maybe through behavior, if you don't solve it, you die. So how is that for the, temperature? Is that okay?
Yeah, but
Yeah,
it's
well,
still,
just one point on temperature. I think it's a great question, and you are indicating like sort of the real ontological base existence reality, which of course even people have different views on that, but you can model the unobserved state as like, we could say this is the SAT score, but we're not fully observing it because we have a partially ripped up file. So the modeling of what is a hidden state versus an observable is really just a question of like, what do you have data for, and then what do you want to include as a causal or latent factor in your model, but you don't necessarily have data for as an observable. But you may even choose to have hidden states for things that you could get data for. So I think that's the kind of deflationary bent in this textbook, and maybe in many people's active inference journeys, when the model itself is built, as they encourage people to do from the first chapter to the last, then you see the specifics of how it plays out in that generative model, and the contributions to the field consist of specific generative models made and general claims with the active inference ontology.
could I just say, Alexei, the thing that it struck me is that in order to act in the world, to remove myself from the temperature that's going to burn my skin, I don't actually have to know anything about the generative process. I can make assumptions about the generative process and then act in the world to try to alter that. But my confusion lies with how we can then, within a model construction, dictate what the generative process is. And I can understand why you have to do that if you're going to create a model, but it kind of just doesn't speak to the ideas laid out in chapter 1 in this book. That's
Another angle is when you approach a specific question or line of inquiry, you're not trying to make the total twin through a scientific model. You could learn something about the knee without having the full simulation, whatever that would even mean, of a knee. So in the specific modeling, but maybe that's coming from an experimentalist's perspective, so I'm not sure. Alexi?
Yeah, I had maybe a reaction, but I wonder if maybe we need to time to let this idea sink. Is it appropriate for me to ask another question on a slightly different topic, or would that be too abrupt?
Yeah, definitely. That sounds totally good. If it's here, or just ask it.
So it's about chapter 1, and I'm reacting to this text. Action is quintessentially goal-directed and purposive. Okay. So I understand that, there's a goal to stay alive, no questions, right? But, if we move to human subjects, and, please forgive me, sort of clinical psychology, psychotherapy, and there's a ton of action that humans do that at least doesn't appear as goal-directed or purposive. In fact, if every action humans did was goal-directed and purposive, we wouldn't need psychotherapy at all. Like we have, I don't know, maladaptive behaviors, we have obsessions, compulsions, tics, and whatnot. So I'm not exactly sure if we stand with that postulate that every action is quintessentially goal-directed and purposive, would that model not oversimplify things for human subjects?
That's a great question. A short thought on it, and then anyone can raise their hand, is even an isochade can be purposive because you can explain it in terms of using this framework. So it doesn't necessarily mean that in some integrated way, it's beneficial for the person's life or for any given social recognition or bodily health necessarily, because you can do modeling of pathologies too. But the purposiveness is just local teleology, local directedness, moving the elbow from one to do a slot machine again and again is purposive. You can argue whether it is with the person's long-term professional interest, but the action is still purposive.
Yeah, well, my issue with the teleological explanation is that it is often very speculative when people, for example, tell me that my state of depression has a purpose to inform me that I have an unmet need, which is mainstream, models in clinical psychology sometimes. Like, how do you know that depression doesn't have 5 different purposes and models? We pretty much, if you say infer or speculate that that's the purpose of depression. So the teleology is a little kind of weird for me. Maybe it is mainstream and active inference framework, but it's a little weird. Yeah, but maybe I'll think about it more. A related question is this: when we say the goal-directed character of action, the question is whose goal? Again, going back to human subjects, there's conscious, there's unconscious processes, and sometimes people do something and they're like, I did this thing, I rationally know I shouldn't have done it, but I did it anyway, which suggests that they have multiple components of their agency and not just, a unitary John who, decided all the goals and purposes. So the question is, whose goals? What exactly do we assume unitary? Do you assume that the agent is a singular thing?
Yeah, great question, Kate.
Well, my thoughts on this are that I would say that in my understanding, at least, active inference views the mind as a hierarchical structure, but definitely hierarchical build-up of many different sub-layers of the brain. And ultimately, the goal of therapy, like I'm not a therapist, but in some way could be the integration of all these different selves. But those by themselves, the lower levels, the lower parts of the hierarchy or components of the hierarchy, within their own domain, they are purposive. The action within those domains, they don't serve the host necessarily as such, but within their own logic, internal logic, even if you could put it in the math, it would fit the free energy principle and the active inference. So the goal there is to figure out how to bring the hierarchy together in a more purposive or healthy way. That's the thought that your comment triggered, Alexei. That's all I have to say about that.
I'm very much for this thought, and it's beautiful, except, bear with me, maybe I'm a devil's advocate, but what I see in clinical work and what is mainstream in psychodynamic psychotherapy is mental conflicts, such as, I want this, but I cannot have it, or I should be doing this, but I want to do something else, or I want A and B and they're mutually exclusive. And in that regard, there is no hierarchy. There is an unresolved conflict. Mind in a conflict is very mainstream, kind of 100-year-old clinical tradition. And, ultimately you don't resolve those things, that mind goes from one conflict to another to the third one. We have multiple needs, like the famous Madonna whore syndrome is an example of that. And how people find a compromise from that is a sort of personality. So I just do think that some of these assumptions and postulates we make early on, that there's a, either it's resolved through the hierarchy or that there's a singular agent whose goals and purposes we follow are, okay for a bacteria, but maybe not for a human mind.
Well, but Cart Harris, his studies on psychedelics and his theory of how the psychedelics would kind of reset the priors, reset the precision of the priors, the valence, and in many cases, it oftentimes helps with some of the symptoms, which would argue for that view. So you may not be able to do it verbally through verbal interaction or through language, but in some other, parts of it may be open to more chemical or, neurotransmitter kind of related reset as opposed to a verbal reset. Anyway.
Just to kind of give it one thought, and then Ali, goal is not really a required term, just my personal view, in the active inference ontology. We don't talk about kicking a ball through a goal. We don't talk about a milestone based goal. It doesn't come up when we're actually using the active ontology. It's not a parameter in the model, but cybernetics has long been, and teleos and all of these debates. So I think actually what's really exciting, and I'll say here for now, is it actually points towards exciting different ways of understanding purposeful behavior and where goals and reward come into play by thinking about likely paths being selected rather than rewarding paths, and how that generalizes across a system that stays in a wooden groove, and how that also may relate to these higher order sophisticated cognitive functions like narrative. But that is not something that we're going to see in figure 4.3. That's something where once you build that Tower of Babel, then you'll know. But hypothetically, what can you say without the generative model of what people are talking about? Because we're not talking about just the base 4 nodes, modeling the whole brain like that. If you were going to make a model that had multiple debating personalities, then it simply would have that feature. Ali?
Well, actually, I think the term action here is used instead of, to refer to intentional action. So I don't think it's action in its broadest sense. But even if we restrict ourselves to only intentional actions, there are some theories, both philosophical and in cognitive science, that tries to somehow frame this notion of action in terms of an alternative conception of causality. So one notable work in that regard is the work of Alicia Huarjero in her book Dynamics in Action. So in this book, the basic premise of this book is exactly the question: what is the difference between a wink and a blink, right? So, in order to come up with a viable theory of action that can include all of these intentional and non-intentional actions, she proposes a theory of causation based not on traditional linear cause and effects, but rather looking at the whole complex adaptive system as possessing some constraints, and looking at those constraints as somehow giving rise to causation. So, in other words, what we mean by causation is actually undertaken by those constraints of those complex adaptive systems. Sorry. So these dynamical constraints can actually account for both bottom-up and top-down causal relations. So in this sense, it can include both intentional action and non-intentional action. And if we take goal-directed action as kinds of action that tries to satisfy those dynamical constraints, then this claim in the book can make sense in this complex dynamical system framework.
Great, thank you. Alexi?
I just had a couple of reactions, Daniel, to what you said, and thank you for your comment about goal being necessary or not. Please forgive me if my metaphors are very simplistic. So the car sitting in the parking lot idling, burning gas, is increasing entropy. It is not moving anywhere, right? A car going to where I need it to go is going toward a goal, and perhaps it is wasting some energy as well. So if we remove the goal out, then, how will we actually look at the free energy versus, the energy used toward a meaningful purpose? So I think implicitly, perhaps a goal is to survive for an organism and to maintain survival evolutionarily, survive until reproductive age and reproduce. Some kind of goals like that exists, perhaps. If you take all of them out, then it's all entropy, right? And also I had a maybe reaction to Kate that, I am very, very respectful of Cartwright Harris's work and psychedelics. With that, I'm highly skeptical of the idea of reset or anything brief, because, attachment style in a human being takes from 6 to 18 months. 9 women pregnant for a month will not produce a baby. Personality takes time to form, and all of this sort of quick, resets, whether it's ayahuasca or ketamine or even electroconvulsive therapy, I just don't buy that. I think that it's mind in a conflict remains in a conflict. It just how it solves the conflict is the question. It may be solving it more adaptively, more, in a more nuanced way, but I don't think that anything quick like a magic wand of psychedelics will resolve that in any way. So.
Yeah, one paper by Adam Saffron is the Albus model. So while that relaxation of beliefs was more visible, and led to a kind of relaxation-based emphasis on what psychedelics might do, which may be half the picture. Adam just kind of generalized it to altering, like, well, depending on which generative model you make or how you think about what the brain is or whatever, different pharmaceutical or non-pharmaceutical experiences are going to not just purely relax a distribution, because the distributions are part of the map. So I think like it's not a property of a physical molecule to do so, except again interpreted in this more abstract causal space. To your question, Alexei, you should talk about a car in the parking lot. It's great. It's just disordering material and it's not going anywhere. It's not goal oriented, but its purpose could be described hyperlocally as just being in one place, like a rock's purpose, just using, again, this broader concept of purpose, which doesn't come up in the acting ontology. We don't need the goal, but the rock's goal is just to be right there. The leaf's goal is to go downstream. So by having a deflationary optional concept of intentional behavior, including like Carl Friston's wood lice example, where there was insects running around on the pavement and they went faster where it was light and slower where it was dark. So they accumulated where it was dark. So including a whole continuum of intentionality based upon return to an attracting set it just turns out to be enormously general. Now, how to connect that to the physical entropy lost by organisms, open question. And then how to use some other terms from thermodynamics, like what would informational work be versus informational heat? Well, Chris Fields is certainly approaching those types of questions, but I hope that addresses a few pieces of it. Something doing the most likely thing is exactly the criterion that you would use for statistics. And so in that way, it's why we can use statistics so adeptly in this modeling, because statistics isn't about simply maximizing reward, but like all statistics is about finding this path of least action in an informational space. Ali?
Sorry, it was my hand risen from before. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Anyone who hasn't brought something up, just definitely it's gone all over, which is totally cool. But if somebody wants to go to a specific question of chapter 1 or a quote, we could do that.
I did want to chime in on the previous topic about action is quintessentially goal-directed and propulsive. So I mean, we have some ways to get further into the textbook, but I mean, we're going to be going over things like policy selection, kind of like, I'm assuming active inference involves not just settling upon a single unchanging policy, right? Continuing with that. That's what an agent operates with. Rather, it would be, a potential entire series of competing policies that may very well be actively updated based upon what the agent has maybe learned in the past, new incoming observations. So I'm just kind of reflecting on everything that's been said. And because whenever I read this, it feels a little bit easier for me to take the phrase goal directed with a bit of a grain of salt and think like, oh, there could be multiple, potentially even conflicting policies in play that themselves are constantly potentially changing or shifting in a variety of ways. So it's just a kind of final comment, I suppose, on that topic I was thinking about.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's so true. Policy is evaluated every time step. So this is exactly how we integrate action into the loop, whether like OODA loop or just behavioral loop. So that's a great point. Terry?
Just I thought the way I interpreted that was that the goal isn't the goal is fundamentally to answer questions of the universe and therefore get evidence that then can be fed into the variational free energy model to either update our priors or act in the world to reduce the variational free energy. So the goal isn't a goal to achieve an end. The end is to answer the question about minimizing variational free energy. And then our behavior in the world that we read as policy-led, goal-directed is actually more a function of that primary objective of the organism, which is to minimize variational free energy.
Great points. Again, I'd highlight that we can model a baseball on a parabola as doing the most likely thing. We could identify a radioactive isotope that's probabilistically emitting things over a given time window as doing the most expected thing. So a lot can get brought into statistics, which does breed this whole fascinating area of like map territory type distinctions. So suffice to say, action is going to be totally integrated into this model, enabling a lot of interpretations as the recent literature witnesses. Lexi?
Thank you so much, Daniel. I was just, thinking about what everybody said, but I think your word intentionality connected it for me. And maybe the issue that I have, please forgive me, is lexical, because so in my world, intentionality is required. The sentence you said that rock's goal is to stay in place is an oxymoron in sort of psychology, because you can only have a goal if you have a mind. So in that regard, bacteria that moves toward the gradient of the food and withdraws from pain does not have a goal and a purpose because it ain't got a mind. So that maybe is a different use of language. And if they use the word goal here in a sense that the rock's goal is to stay in place, it's an attribution. Perhaps it's an unfortunate use of a term, but maybe we can say it's, the rock's dynamics are to stay in place, but it doesn't have any goals. There's no mind there. There's no agent. There's no agent capable of choosing A versus B in a rock.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like in sort of in a narrow and a broad sense, sometimes there's going to be like gray area assignment, just like well, this enzyme wants to bind to this one. I've heard it 1,000 times. So it's like but it's not intended as a reflexive statement about the protein being a strange loop. Maybe it's below some level of critical ability, but we can model this all in an integrated fashion. So we can still model the game theory of something that we don't even think plays an implicit representational game. That's why there's this whole representationalist debate. And then we can do all these kinds of modelings really composably, which is kind of the exciting piece, which is also why the kernel, ultimately what we're working towards, like figure 4.3, these generative models, the kernel's very, it's not applicable to any given situation except a purely pedagogical, and it's extremely sparse on commitments because it's basically of the same type as every other statistical model in Bayesian statistics. So it's not like an esoteric type of model, but it opens many questions that I think, again, we see every day, which is really exciting and part of the fun, and why many people can contribute in as well. But there's just so many interesting angles to it. And I think also Sanjeev's textbook that is in progress with several of you here who may be in that group, like there's a whole statistics degree / undergraduate or beyond leading up to a lot of things that really help set the stage. And his work, I think, will be like for people who want to see that level of depth, and then meanwhile understanding what other fun paths and ways are there in this whole work. Because certainly it's always, every sentence you could be like, what is happening? And if this word meant that, and if this person was defining it this way. So certainly finding a path on through, and like, what's the claim when a lot of it is internally referential. However, that's part of its coherence and consistency. And but sometimes the evidence for the consistency is a little bit hard to convey because these are relatively recent understandings. Hopefully that's just like a little context. What's it? Anyone else have a thought or a question on chapter 1? Terry, or then anyone else?
It's relevant to this thing about that a rock has no mind, but a rock is maybe over longer time scales, to sustain itself as a rock, it has to minimize its free energy in terms of its interactions with the external state. And whenever the variational free energy within that system alters, it will maybe oxidize or, get broken up, or it can't act in the world to maintain its variational free energy at a minimum, but it still has to maintain that variational free energy at a minimum. And when it can't, it changes to something else. So, the notion that because all objects in the world sustain themselves in their not in the state that they are currently in by minimizing variational free energy, whether you're a tree, a human, a rock, or a galaxy, probably. What's your reaction to that? Because I know that they referenced like trees can't do things, but trees do communicate with each other. As we and I suppose I'm struck by this concept of panpsychism that exists within the sort of the thinkers in the nature of consciousness. I'm just interested. It's something that was stimulated by what Alexei said, and I'm interested in what you have to say about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's so many interesting areas you brought up, and the way that there could be a kind of deflationary account where it's pan-cognitivist or just pan-computationalist, but then people debate what's a computer, and they say, well, it's pan-cognitivist, but then they debate what is cognition. Is the baseball computing, and is the water computing where it expects to be downhill? So those are all the debates, but most of us see a world with dense but sparse connectivities. So it sometimes it's like a lot of problem admiration, which can be a good thing. But pointing to communication pathways amongst living things is only surprising in light of extremely recent specific scientific observations. So, but I'm not sure. I mean, there's so many other areas you brought up in the consciousness, and I mean, these are all the huge questions. Ali?
Yeah, again, one of the other common misconceptions about FEP is that some people think FEP as providing kind of ontological conditions for existence, or at least persistence through time. But actually, what FEP claims is that if something exists, it must have properties that look as if they follow the path of least action. So it's the other way around. FEP doesn't provide any conditions for the existence or persistence through time at all. But it rather, I mean, if we take the persistence or the existence as the basic premise of our argument, then we can follow that by describing the behavior of the phenomenon or the system by describing the trajectories of their variational density in terms of least action principle. So I think this is one of the things that people sometimes criticize FEP as something that, of course, it's claimed to be theory of everything, but it's not something as some ontological or metaphysical theory for anything. It just tries to describe, beginning from the ontological existence, it tries to describe the ensuing characteristics of the systems that persist through time, and in particular, highly complex, high-dimensional, self-organizing systems.
Amazing points, Ali. Thank you. The condition of modeling something is to have these properties. Every measurement that's if it's static, it's at the its movement is within the measurement, the classical limit. If it's so dynamic, it's moving faster than the timescale measurement. You just get basically uninformative signal. So we have this kind of tuned in Bucky-Fuller zone of modeling, proximal modeling, which we can extend with microscopes, telescopes. That's one way to look at this. That's a kind of like scientific realism approach. But then for things that you can't or didn't model, you have hidden states. So ultimately you have it covered. But then this is really the inversion of the ontological theories of everything, that this is how it really is. This is how it is out there. This is how the metaphysics are that, project our world a certain way. That is like why ontology is the philosophy of what is. However, if we precondition upon existence, someone will look at an ant and why did it go off the trail there? It's like, but you have the whole evolutionary history that sets up its decision making. So maybe the purposiveness of that, you might have a super deflationary response. But again, whatever level of sophistication the thing is, from essentially inert or totally inert to repetitive motion to sophisticated motion, that can be understood by an observer as a path of least action. as they do statistics. So in that sense, it licenses little more metaphysics than a linear regression as an analytic method. Then I think, again, there's so many interesting angles why it has been discussed in all of these more philosophical contexts. Because reductionism isn't the whole picture. So the theory in itself, or any given theory in itself, might not take on all these accounts. And there may just be tangled webs of perspectives and different languaging and different applications around some of these topics. But it is fun and fast when it's small and the few people's perspectives are essentially knowable. And there are always new information coming in literally through these funny modern channels, and hearing what Maxwell and Carl et al. Think. Andrew?
Yeah, I just my 2 cents there is that I find the pan-cognitive stuff rather interesting. Than that said, I personally came to active inference because I'm interested in its application to living systems and especially human beings, and so the brain from a neuroscience perspective, but also how it might be applied in working with psychopathologies, treatments, and so on. And so I think so far I'm just viewing it in a more pragmatic sense of like, how can we use this in the same way that I also work as a data scientist. And so I don't view everything as a gradient boosting machine, but I will attempt to apply a model to a situation to see if I can get anything useful out of it, right? So that's kind of how I've taken this so far. I mean, I've read some really fascinating papers, one by a psychiatrist who applied active inference to post-traumatic stress disorder, described hyper precise priors in the upper cortical regions as like, someone who experiences reliving that, that can be triggered by a certain phenomena that kind of spark or activate those previous priors, and that gets superimposed onto incoming sensory observations, even though it's inaccurate. So that's, I mean, I'm personally a little less concerned with the precision of ontological claims and so on, but kind of how this can help us to reinterpret different kinds of phenomena, and from there maybe use it for good, for some kind of useful purpose. Sounds really, it's really fascinating. So it's
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. It is very interesting. Anyone else want to just give a comment in the last minutes? Well, otherwise, we will be going into chapter 2. Chapter 2 is going to be another 2 weeks. We can look at the figure and look at the high road and low road again to kind of look ahead. Low road and the high road. Chapter 2 and chapter 3, that will be the coming month. Also, some people have asked about the math learning group. So I made a little comment thread. If you just comment on this thread, then I think people who want to do a certain kind of work can maybe find each other this way. And it can be in the Discord or a Jitsi link, or however people prefer. Yeah, continue to check out and comment or improve if you want any of the AI math things as we head into chapter 2. Explore which of these equations, if you can evaluate which one of these AI explanations or make comments on them. Some are useful, some are not. So, but I hope there's a lot of fun things we can do in the coming weeks. Chapter 2 is definitely going to get into it because it just starts the real non-introduction part of the book. But yeah, does anyone have any other thoughts or questions, or anyone who's read chapter 2 before want to give a teaser or Ali, go for it.
Well, yeah, actually, chapter 2 is where the real fun begins. I mean, after the introductory chapter, now we're into the real thick of things by considering two of the most central equations of active inference, namely equations 2.5 and 2.6, one for variational free energy, the other for expected free energy, which will come to time and time again throughout the whole book. So it's probably one of the most fundamental important chapters.
Great comments. Anyone else want to add anything? Okay. All right. Thank you all. See you around. Bye.
Thank you.